And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard. I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Thursday, July 11th, and this outlook will be for Friday and Saturday. But first, we'll take a look at the sea ice in the far north, the Chukchi Sea. We have a lot of open water now, especially from Wainwright southwestward and down through the Bering Strait. We continue to see the ice melting off along the northern and eastern Arctic coastline there of the Beaufort Sea. And this trend will only continue as we head through the mid and late summer period, though again, temperatures have been a bit cooler than normal along this area of the state. We've had high temperatures generally in the upper 30s along the far north, with some 40s here down along the Chukchi Sea coastline to the Bering Strait. And the weather systems that are going to be dominant here going into the weekend, by late tonight, early on Friday morning, we have this broader circulation over the eastern half of the Bering Sea, and this is a pocket of colder air aloft, a colder core low that dropped down out of the Arctic Ocean a few days ago, and it's going to help spin up the secondary low that's going to become a more notable system here going into the weekend. But this is going to provide another round of steady rain later this Thursday night through the day Friday along the southwest coast and extending inland. By the time we get into Friday afternoon, here's that secondary low development that's going to continue to ride northeastward across Kodiak Island, splitting around the Kenai Peninsula. And this front is going to be a pretty strong one. A lot of warm, moist air to the southwest of it. And along this frontal boundary, we do expect some gale force winds, perhaps into Cook Inlet to entrance there, and especially along the north central Gulf, Kayak Island on over toward Hinchinbrook entrance will likely have gales upwards of 40 knots on Saturday with the system, along with periods of moderate to heavy rain that'll overspread the Gulf Coast region and into the Panhandle later this weekend, as well as further north up into the central and eastern interior, so that by Saturday afternoon we have a low there just near Kodiak City with the front arcing ahead of it. Strong east-southeasterly flow there in the north central Gulf, and as I said, areas of moderate to heavier rainfall where you have enhancement due to the terrain with those southeasterly winds. So the forecast, the marine weather outlook here for Friday across the inner channels of the Panhandle, southeast to south winds 10 to 15 knots, waves 2 to 3 feet. For the outer coast, look for winds generally southerly 15 knots south of Sitka, swells 5 feet, and then southeast winds 15 to 20 knots extending up outside of Yakutat Bay to Cape Suckling with swells of 5 to 6 feet. For Saturday, inner channel still look for southeast winds 10 to 15 knots, waves running 2 to maybe 3 feet there within Lynn Canal. For the outer coast, south winds 20 to 25 knots south of Sitka, but then look for southeast winds 25 knots increasing to easterly 35 knot gales around Cape Suckling, and swells out that way building 9 to 11 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, Friday, strongest winds entrance of Cook Inlet, southeast 30 knots, swells 8 to 9 feet. Middle upper Cook Inlet, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots and waves 3 to 4 feet there. Easterly winds 15 knots, 2-3 foot waves within Prince William Sound, and then along the Kenai coast and outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, winds will be southeast to east around 20 knots. But look at on Saturday with that strong gale force front working its way northward along the north central Gulf Coast, we expect easterly gales 40 knots there just outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, 30 knot winds within Prince William Sound out of the east, and then down along the length of Cook Inlet, generally north-northeast winds 25 knots with waves there 6 to 7 feet. Now on Friday, Kodiak Island will see easterly winds at east-southeast winds 25 knots, and then across the upper half of the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds to 30 knots, including there into Bristol Bay. Switching back around, though, to the west-northwest, as high as 30 knots there just outside of False Pass. And for Saturday, winds will generally be out of the west around 20 knots region-wide from Kodiak Island down the length of the Alaska Peninsula. Waves anywhere from 4 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side and 4 to 6 feet as well from Bristol Bay down to north of Cold Bay. Across the Aleutian chain, winds will be northwesterly 20-25 knots over the eastern Aleutians on Friday, northerly central Aleutians to 15 knots, and then backing around to the east at 20 knots, especially once you get around and west of Kiska. For Saturday, winds will generally be out of the west around 20-25 knots across the eastern Aleutians, but become variable, only around 10 knots from Adak westward all the way out to Shemya. And looking at winds Friday within Bristol Bay, southeast to 30 knots, east winds to 25 knots in Kuskokwim Bay. Easterly flow, 30 knots out of Norton Sound, 25 knots out of areas of the Yukon coast, and then look for west-northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, St. Matthew down to St. Paul. And for Saturday, we still have this low circulation in this region here off the Yukon Delta. So southwest winds 20 knots into Kuskokwim and Bristol Bay. Southerly winds 15 knots along the Yukon coastline and up into Norton Sound, but on the backside, look for northwest to west winds 25 to 30 knots from St. Matthew down through the Pribilof Islands with swells there of 8 to 9 feet. South of the Bering Strait, look for easterly winds of 20 to 25 knots off of the Seward Peninsula and north side of St. Lawrence Island. As we come up through the Chukchi Sea, winds will fall off a bit, more easterly 5 to 15 knots, lower Chukchi Sea, and then flipping around to the northeast, especially once you get north of Cape Lisburne up to Utqiagvik, northeast winds to 15 knots, and then easterly winds from Prudhoe Bay on over to Kaktovik at 10 knots. And for Saturday, easterly winds around 10 knots continue along the central eastern Arctic coast, northeasterly there. Utqiagvik down through Point Hope, 15 to 20 knots. Generally easterly winds out of Kotzebue Sound and south of Point Hope. And then passing through the Bering Strait, look for southeasterly winds, Nome on up toward Port Clarence, but northeasterly winds to 25 knots on the north side of St. Lawrence Island around Gamble, with waves running through the Bering Strait and down there into areas off of the Seward Peninsula, 3 to 5 feet.